Good morning, everyone. Good morning and welcome to day 2 of the virtual Illinois 60 by 25 conference. My name is Sam Nelson. I'm with the Illinois Student Assistance Commission, and on behalf of all the network organizers, we want to thank you, all of our speakers and all the attendees from yesterday, our first day of the conference, for making it such a success. Despite it being a virtual event, we had some really terrific discussions in our sessions and some engagement in our breakout rooms that really connected some people that will carry on after our event's over. So that was really great. If you weren't able to be part of day 1 of our conference, we did do a recap e-message that was sent out yesterday, kind of highlighting all the sessions, but you also can have access to all the sessions from yesterday on our conference website. So again, if you go to the 60by25.org website and click on the 2021 conference, you'll have links to both the webinar recordings and also any handout and presentations from yesterday's sessions. So I want to go ahead and make sure that we're making the best use of our time. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker for this morning. And again, this session, just to make sure you're in the right place, is Socially Just Community Colleges, Beyond Espousing Diversity to Actualizing Equity. And today our presenter is Dr. Eboni Zamani-Gallaher. Dr. Zamani-Gallaher is a professor of higher education and community college leadership and director of the Office of Community College Research and Leadership. She previously served as associate head of the Department of Education, Policy, Organization, and Leadership, and Associate Dean of the Graduate College at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And she also serves as the Executive Director of the Council for the Study of Community Colleges. So with that introduction, I'd like to go ahead and invite Dr. Eboni to start sharing her screen and to go with her presentation. I will note we will have time for question and answers. So if you do have questions, if you want to go ahead and populate that in the Q&A feature, rather than the chat, we'll monitor the Q&A and we'll have opportunity to look at some of those later. So with that, Doctor, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Well, good morning, and thanks so much for the invitation to spend time with you today. As Sam mentioned, I am at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and today I want to spend some time talking with you about community colleges, but education writ large in respect to issues of equity and how we can make steps toward advancing equity, particularly equity that is not color evasive. So just in terms of our time at a glance, I want to tell you a little bit about the Office for Community College Research and Leadership. Some of you may be familiar with us, others of you may not be, and so I'll share a little bit about how I enter this space relative to the work that we do and how it relates to today's topic, as well as talk about some of the antecedents to where we are right now. And so, kind of have a conversation, if you will, around what I call the backstory and the way in which we have the paradox of having realities that don't align with the rhetoric that we hear in relationship to equity matters. Talk about racial inequity, issues around campus climate, race relations, and how that actually provokes racialized role strain. And then have some discussion around how we can move from a place of being aware to actually acting. And then we'll have a little time on the back end for Q&A. So in terms of the Office of Community College Research and Leadership, we have been around for a little over 30 years. This is our 32nd year. In 1989, Dr. Deborah Bragg, the founding director of OCCRL, began the office with a through line of wanting to make sure that youth and adults move in, through, and out of community colleges. And as we look at how diverse populations do so, we do so in a way where we are very intentional about how we employ culturally relevant and equity-focused approaches to our work in terms of how we study and how we evaluate and how we conduct research relative to community colleges, but not just community colleges, because as we consider ourselves community college centered, we are not community college solely. And so we are very much concerned with a P20 approach to issues of educational equity. In addition, we try to promote what our holistic approaches and equitable engagement is how we try to enter the space in terms of asking folks to be equity minded. And so while we have, many that tell us they are equity minded. They also have ways in which they conflate what is equity and what is diversity and what is inclusion. And so we really try to take a systemic viewpoint that helps folks to dislodge silos that are internal as well as external in terms of the work that they do in promoting what our collaborative approaches to ensuring academic quality and programs of study throughout P20 education that can provide equitable outcomes across diverse learners. So some of the efforts that we have, this is not an exhaustive list, but it definitely is, some of our portfolio that very much is in alignment with, today's topic. Much of the through line, again, is how we center equity within the portfolio. So now I want to get into what I'm calling kind of the backstory, if you will. And so I'd like to take a little bit of time to have us kind of flash back in order to fast forward. And so consider in 1967, right, over 50 years ago, President Lyndon B. Johnson charged the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders. And the purpose of this 11-member committee was to examine as well as explain what was happening in the way of the riots since the summer of '64. There had been numerous riots. And so the report had been referred to as the Kerner report, was released in April of 1968. And that actually concluded with what we saw as two periods of space of how folks operated and moved throughout society, in which case we thought, this is, again, two separate societies, one that is white, one that is Black, separate and unequal. So the report then considered, well, what is this going on in terms of how we recommend to bring equity? So they thought about job training, and they thought about issues of educational and housing discrimination and opportunities that needed to be advanced. However, within a month of the reporting, there had been riots that had broken out across the US as there had been the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And, again, as evidence of a racial divide, you had over 100 cities that had erupted on the heels of the assassination. And so there's been some inconsistency with which we have, had a legacy, if you will, of unevenness, of oppression, a society in terms of the US having a history as well as the present day effects of genocide and segregation, the legacy of slavery, and all of that, which has, preceded now, but has actually perpetuated as well as deepened what we have, whether it's passive or active assaults that result in dehumanization and racialized inequity in our society. We have that threaded through the fabric of this country because there's never been a full accounting and truth and reconciliation for America's historical past and the current day effects thereof, whereby there is very much, a notion of white patriarchal hegemonic norms and a default of really just falling to status quo perennially. So we have this distinction, this paradox, this contradictory nature of, wanting to be our aspirational selves and have meaningful and intentional efforts to dismantle systemic racism, but the actions don't always couple up or align with that which we desire and say that we want in society. And so as we fast forward and think about, again, today, the racial divide and how there's been growing concern, particularly in lieu of the recent insurrection on the nation's capital, we have lots of issues at play. We have we have pipelines to prison instead of post-secondary. If you look at the unemployment data, if you look at what's happening in the way of, some colorblind repression and lawlessness relative to unchecked killing of unarmed Black folks, whether it's racial segregation in terms of residential patterns, and an erosion, honestly, of democratic values. We continue to see what's playing out in large society as a fragmented one. And so when we talk about, society in large, I want to kind of, show where we are, right? So America has become increasingly diverse. We're more racially diverse. We're older. We are also, at a pivotal time in our society where, and in terms of our history, that our educational enterprises are very important, and that they also mirror what is happening in larger society. And so while we continue to kind of operate in the same manner as the larger society in terms of a system that norm references whiteness, and whiteness being the dominant culture, what we also see play out is that one way dominance functions is by remaining unexamined. Author Jason Katz often says that's how dominance functions, and that whiteness functions by remaining unexamined. And so to that end, during our time together, I offer, some food for thought in terms of what could be considerations, with regard to how we can not just aspire, but take action steps toward being equity conscious in terms of how we understand social justice is something that's not divorced from racial equity in terms of student experiences and student outcomes, and how the community college as an enterprise, the two-year sector, also known as the people's colleges, can ill afford to be color evasive and must be much more intentional and purposeful in moving the needle forward on what have been persistent racialized inequalities and inequities among student populations. So, on this slide, I have, the elusiveness of equity, right? And so what I want to spend some time talking about is, again, as we think about ways to advance our youth, as well as adult learners, one of the things we need to make sure that we're understanding in terms of the realities of our demographics is the fact that we are very much en route to becoming a majority minority nation. In fact, in parts of the country, we know that that's already the case, with populations of color expected to outnumber non-white or non-Hispanic whites by 2045. We also know that within this share of what we see as an older and growing, but more diverse browning, if you will, of society, that within our own state for Illinois, that the Hispanic Latinx population is the 5th largest in the nation. And so we, as in terms of the mid-Atlantic, or not mid-Atlantic, the Great Lakes region, are an outlier, if you will, with respect to diversity. And so we see the diversity in terms of some variation and patterns relative to geographical location. So what I want to do at this point is to spend a little time, I had in the kind of at a glance preliminary that we would talk a little bit about racial inequity. Well, one thing I would like to do in terms of just some framing is to also share how we think about equity at OCCRL. We define equity as a process that identifies disparities and how those disparities then affect opportunities, whether it be economic, educational, social, opportunities, career, and how those opportunities in terms of advancement, mobility, are then based on identities whereby marginalized folks with marginalized social identities subsequently are not necessarily having the same advancement opportunities due to some systemic issues at play. And so we feel that there's a necessity to develop what are strategic solutions to take systemic action relative to redressing these inequities, as well as to have what would be an ongoing, as well as a sustainable, equity-centered framework and lens by which we then can achieve what is the ultimate goal, which is equality. A lot of times people will use those as euphemisms for one another, when in fact they're not interchangeable, equality and equity. And then being more nuanced as we think about racial equity as a systemic assessment of how racially equitable systems can uplift, as well as increase participation and access and opportunity. Kind of look to the work of Sam Musayas and colleagues around historically minoritized people of color, and the extent to which they can and should be equally ingrained into academic and social practices and policies and structures within the institution. So when we think about where we are in terms of our demographics more broadly, and then how that plays out in terms of who's at work, you can see that the current workforce as well as the projected workforce in terms of racial and ethnic diversity. We also have where you see there are some correlations, if you will, with respect to race and income. And so the extent to which we have racial equity then presents, what is a rising tide. But again, it's not necessarily about, a tide that can rise all boats, right? That a rising tide lifts all boats. It's not so much that, but again, when we think about how we can seek to level the playing field, how we eliminate racial inequities, particularly with regard to income, and using targeted strategies to do so, can help us to address the gaps in both employment and wages. And part of how we get there also is that correlation of education and earnings. And so we'll talk a little bit about that to come. But also, because we know that there's a correlation between earnings and education, when we look at unemployment, again, race is not mitigating unemployment, but it's exacerbating unemployment. And that's also the case where when we see racialized minorities, folk of color, even in lieu of having comparable educational credentials, still face larger shares or higher percentages of folk of color remain unemployed. And so, overall, there's been where people of color have faced greater exclusion, in the labor market, and not as much mobility within that, given what we see relative to some of the participation and completion data, whereby, again, education, on average, will suggest greater earnings potential and mobility for those that have a degree or some type of post-secondary credential. So this slide where I have, you've heard of that adage, or the description of higher ed as the ivory towers. That's quite literal and figuratively speaking when we say ivory towers. Racial, ethnic, as well as class-based disparities in college access and participation, as well as completion, have been very persistent. And given this enduring inequality within our higher ed system, there's some particularly acute racialized inequities that we see play out. So that shows up in enrollments, as well, again, in terms of students' experiences, and the extent to which we may or may not have equitable outcomes among, historically marginalized, racially minoritized students. So therefore, we have to think about equity gaps between and within groups And more often than not, what happens is in some of the work that we do at OCCRL, and I personally will have educators to tell me that they are committed to diversity, that they want to ensure equity, but at the same time, they can't face race. And so more often than not, when we are talking about equity gaps, what is put forth are pie charts and tables that have data points relative to dashboards with white, Hispanic, Asian, Black. And so what we're really talking about aren't just, again, blanket inequities, but racialized inequities, and therefore the equity gaps that are between and within groups, as well as that along the socioeconomic background. And, they are happening relative to the color line. And so we have where white students, more affluent students, are faring better than Native American, Indigenous student learners, or African-American, Black students, Hispanic and Latinx students. And then Asian American students are outpacing other racial ethnic groups. And so American colleges definitely have an equity problem. And, post-secondary education in many respects is arguably still separate and unequal, because we do give, all students education. We just don't give all students the same education. And so what's really important as well, when we think about students and their experiences and the extent to which they're equitable, and how their environment, may or may not provide affirmation, where the materials that they encounter within their programs of study, whether or not they are culturally relevant materials, if they have faculty that are utilizing culturally responsive pedagogical practices, and administrators and staff, student services professionals that are really working toward having culturally sustaining practices. It has a lot to do with representation, and representation matters. We know through data from Coupa HR, so the College and University Personnel Human Resources data, that similar to what I have here in terms of faculty representation by institutional type, that similar patterns hold for administrative leaders across ranks, and particularly is much more pronounced in terms of C-suite when we look at the lack of diversity that has not kept pace, whereby our faculties and our staff and administration, as well as our boards, when we look at community college boards of trustees, have not kept pace with the growing diversity of those that we serve. Also, there is not just that they enter, right, but where they enter, and more often than not, there's segmented opportunity that we see patterns in terms of gender and race effect, whereby women are less likely to be in positions that are not contingent faculty positions, as well as folk of color, as well as there being fewer, and a dearth of professors of color that have not just tenure, but have progressed and been promoted through the ranks to full professor. And I think this also has some bearing, if you will, on what we see in terms of what's happening with students, right? Because again, representation matters. So when we think about and look at, and this is data, relative to first major and associate's degrees by gender and race, we see again, what's holding true is larger numbers, percentages of white students overall are completing at the associate's level. This is also the case at the baccalaureate level and beyond, but we see that there is not parity relative to not just participation or access, but the matriculation, persistence, and completion. We also have racial inequities relative to transfer So for those students that aspire a baccalaureate or beyond, and for where students begin, you can see the percent of students from two-year institutions that do end up transferring, and larger numbers of Asian and white students that are transfer aspirants are making the transition, in contrast to Hispanic and Black students. Here's some data relative to the share of adults with at least a bachelor's degree. Again, the trend holds as, again, similar to what we saw in the previous slide. And then also in keeping with what, again, is this association with earnings, like learning and earning, you can see that there's still a tension whereby, again, race exacerbates and does not mitigate, wage differentials in earnings. So even with the same degree, or even without a degree, say, for instance, if you were to take a look at the some college and no degree, just as a case in point, where whites would make $21 per hour with some college and no degree, whereas Blacks will make $17, Latinx $18, $19 for Asian and Pacific Islanders, and then $17 for mixed and for Native American. So so-called good jobs, right? So high skill, high demand, high wage. The share of US workers that are in quote unquote good jobs, when we look at it by race and ethnicity, again, you see a persistent trend here where the pattern holds that, and again, kind of irrespective of educational attainment or highest educational attainment, where whites are the dominant group culture and having access to more of that share of quote unquote good jobs. By contrast, when we think about joblessness, and again, unemployment, this is another way of looking at this by educational attainment, race and ethnicity, and the extent to which someone is Native, what you see is a little different. And so we see higher percentages of folk of color, particularly Blacks and Native Americans, excuse me, as opposed to whites, right? So larger share of good jobs for whites, larger share of the joblessness among Blacks and Natives. So let's take a little time here to talk about some of these inequities, if you will. And so what I'd like to do is, have you just take a quick minute kind of, to ponder, if you will. What do you see play out, right? Because as we think about, in particular, what's happening in society, which is also impacting our campuses, many people are in triage, in a mode of having to respond and to all things COVID. I recently was told by a student affairs professional that while they understand that there's a reckoning with race and on racism, in that there are things that have been happening that are particularly troubling to some, is how she put it, is that we will get around to acknowledging that, because right now we're really having to spend the bulk of our energies responding to COVID, to which, I would offer that, you can't just treat issues of race relations and racism and racial inequities as the commercial break and COVID as the regularly scheduled program. It is an ample both. These things are happening concurrently, and there's arguably been parallel pandemics, even before COVID-19 really hit as a pandemic. Racism has long been in this country a pandemic. And as we think about community colleges, again, democracy's doors, the people's colleges, community colleges have often boasted about being able to provide increased access to post-secondary, and being the avenue by which there's on-ramp to higher education, American higher education, that otherwise may not have been there, right? That there are still ways in which, scholars like Sarah Goldrick-Rab, Michael Bastido, would really argue that even in lieu of affording access, that community colleges are not exempt from complicity and from perpetuating what they consider to be a protecting of privilege, right? And so I think there's some missing pieces as we think about how can we improve completion rates, especially relative to the absence and the lack of addressing racialized inequities, as well as the nuances of considering intersectionality, because that is what's really needed. My colleague Lorenzo Baber and I, speak to this in terms of if we want to help eliminate inequity in community colleges, then part and parcel to doing so is not letting community colleges off the hook because there's a higher proportionality of students of color that are entering, right? And so it's not about, again, just that they enter. What are they leaving with? Are they retained? And as we think about what are some of the approaches and tools, such as, guided pathways, for instance, as one of the latest, greatest kind of educational form approaches or frameworks, right? That while we see promising results with it, that it is not a panacea, it does not provide a silver bullet, and it has not necessarily chipped away at what we see in terms of racialized inequities for students. So that's it. One of the things that's also happening when we think about our campuses and the racialized climate, that again mirrors society. So just similarly, what we see in society is this tension in terms of, this disconnect and disproportionality with regard to whites and then their counterparts that are Black, Latinx, Native American, whether it be in educational levels of educational attainment or employment. But we also see some other things playing out in terms of what's been trending on campuses that again has been happening beyond the borders of the campuses, which is an uptick in hate crimes, racial hate crimes, namely. You can see on this slide that the number of hate crimes on college campuses have been increasing. There's also, since this time in the last 5 years, on average, there's been, upticks of particularly the last 3 years. If you look at data from Federal Crime Bureau statistics, as well as some data from the Anti-Defamation League around hate speech. Again, an uptick in bias incidents reporting, hate crime reporting, hate speech, much of which, the majority of which is racial in nature. So you can see here, this is Department of Ed data and how that's broken down to kind of look at the types of hate crimes. And when we kind of disaggregate and kind of parse out what's happening for community colleges, we see that roughly little over a third of the crimes reported, the highest category at 38% of hate crimes reported on community college campuses are racial hate crimes. And this also has a lot to do with when we say we want to, in this era of completion agenda, have more students, get to a credential 60 by 25, if you will, that we can't get there by not attending to what is happening relative to hostile hallways or chilly campus climates, as that is impacting student persistence and retention, and the extent to which they're having equitable experiences, as well as outcomes relative to completion rates. And so when we think about what's also happening with regard to, the campus climate, both in and out of class, as well as what's happening in the communities with which the campuses are nested in larger society, what is happening too is, inequities that reinforce the racial gaps, whether it be, again, employment and wages or an economy. There's been an intensification, if you will, in inequality and racial inequities. Racial bias and discrimination are still persisting on our campuses. In the labor market, we still have what we see as bias. So whether it's bias in recruiting or hiring, if it's, issues relative to on campuses where students are being profiled. In some of my field work, where we were looking at, the STEM pathways at HSIs, or what we call HSCCs at our place, Hispanic Serving Community Colleges. One of the things that emerged in that field work that we just hadn't anticipated was the fact that students talked about this fatigue of having to legitimize their existence, particularly Black and brown men that we talked to on campus, where they were routinely asked by campus safety, campus police, to produce an ID, or what are you doing here, or being followed, where a car would just kind of trail them. And they would say there would be, white students just going about their business all around them, or napping or doing whatever else, but that they weren't being stopped for walking while white, or studying while, white, but that they were in terms of being Black. So this is happening on our two-year campuses, our community college campuses as well. And so, but this has been 2 decades in the making. We've had what has been the resurgence of high levels of racism and discrimination, if you look at a lot of the data points. And that has beget what is the micro insults, the micro invalidations, the microaggressions, and then particularly for folks of color, racial microaggressions, all of which can manifest themselves in terms of racial battle fatigue. Work from William Smith, who coined the term racial battle fatigue, comes out of a body of work where you think about combat fatigue, but the extent to which there's this racialized role strain, and there's a way in which physiologically, psychologically, emotionally, physically, there are ways in which these everyday slights, however mundane they might appear, have withering effects on folk of color. So again, when we think about what's happening, we really need to have intersectionality as a part of our lens, so that we can see, where kind of power and oppression comes into play across the social identities of our students and ourselves, and how they collide, how they interlock, how they're inextricably linked, right, in terms of how they intersect. And so that it's not simply that there's a race problem, but we also have a gender problem. We also have a class problem. We also have LGBTQIA problems. So, I believe that the work of Kimberly Crenshaw in terms of her intersectionality framework is one that within community college, community colleges, as well as other educational tiers, can and should be more versed with in terms of thinking about how to be much more in tune to the granular nature of othering and the multiplicity of self and aspects of self that are salient for so many of our students. Because there's a way in which this process of constructing racial categories in terms of what's called racialization, you can think about Omni and Wynant's work, is still happening, where there's a way in which we're attaching racial meanings to categories, to people. And so we got to think about that, very thoughtfully, because I think that there's the assumption that if we are folks that think of ourselves as socially just educators, or that our institutions do embrace the equity imperative, that we don't put blinders on in thinking that these institutions are race neutral, or that there aren't racial structures that reproduce or that we need to challenge what I talked about in terms of racialization. And that racial inequality is inherently in all types of educational organizations. And so, some of Sean Harper's work, I think the way in which he has framed, this notion of researchers in particular, when we think about educational researchers, often using and I see this play out with practitioners too. They use a anything but racism approach, is how Harper puts it, to explain what is really a racialized phenomena in post-secondary context. And so that means that often race and racism are generally not named. They are not faced race, right? And they're not named as reasons for what we see play out as the racial differences, or when they are mentioned, they are not engaged with in critical detail. Right. And so I think for much of what I want to share as I look at, in lieu of time, we've got a few more minutes here, is part of social justice, right? If you think about social justice as kind of the umbrella term, that an equity imperative is not siloed from that. And in particular, racial equity, or objectives to have a racially just, educational setting is something that definitely should not be divorced from that. But what we have is a way in which many people who see themselves as more efficacious than honestly they are with regard to being equity minded, are still not critically conscious. And so, as we think about equity mindedness, again, that's a perspective of thinking in terms of, and again, this is drawing from Estella Ben-Simon's work, where, she talks about several factors at play, right? So that it has to be evidence-based. She also says it has to be race conscious, intentionally focused, as well as you need to be systematically aware and ready to be equity advancing. And so for practitioners that want to call attention and do to patterns of inequity and student outcomes, that is what is with regard to equity mindedness, what it is to be equity minded. However, over the years, what I have seen is that what Harper, I just said, refers to as the anything but race approach, that people have kind of locked that on to Estella's equity-minded paradigm. It was never the case whereby she rolled out equity-mindedness as something that was separate and a part of, but not central to, racial equity. Right. And so there's been a way that folks have taken race consciousness out of equity mindedness. In an effort to again, couple those more tightly, in our shop, with my work in particular at OCCRL, we talk about equity consciousness. And that equity consciousness, again, is about how are you taking an onus of responsibility to be an equity oriented change agent. right? So personally, are you aware of the level of equity and inequity that persists, whether it's in your own behaviors, the institution or the organization that you're at with their policies, the settings, and the outcomes? How mindful and how aware are you about unequal opportunities that exist, not just for your students, but for your colleagues? And so equity consciousness is really about how are you creating equity within your school, within your organization, in a manner that seeks to validate as well as acknowledge students, to expose students in ways, to what is the real, right? Not what we are seeking to get right, but that we really actually need to right size. Because again, there's this disconnect between our rhetoric and our reality, so that we reveal the unseen, that we facilitate reflection, that we do the self-work first, because again, there's this consciousness gap within education. And that is where at the heart of it lies the equity imperative. Dorinda Carter-Andrews talks about that, right, in terms of this disconnect, this lack of consciousness being part of what is our equity imperative. And so for me, it also means that we got to get beyond just a very limited, narrow view of the data story, because so much of equity mindedness has also been reduced to, disaggregation of data. But it's not just disaggregation of data, it's about the type of data that you collect. It's the way in which you look at the gaps and the inequities, and you tell the story, and that you still, again, are actively seeking to achieve parity. And ways in which you can do that is, again, thinking about this as a multi-layered approach, right? At an individual level and a personal level. Again, thinking through the resources and supports and the structure you need, and trying to, in a holistic fashion, address what is happening with intentionality in order to chip away at systemic inequities. And so if we kind of break it down and think about, how we might think through how does this work from those different layers of the individual and a personal, institutional, and structural, these are some pieces that you might want to keep in mind. So, I guess what I'd like to say before really wrapping up here is that context matters, right? And I think that there's a way in which within community colleges and other types of post-secondary institutions, or P20, arguably, that we assume that we're past race, that there's ways in which individuals as well as a collective have perceptions of race and racism that have blinders, that are color evasive, that are race neutral, and that actually perpetuates these racialized and equitable structures within organizations. And so you want to challenge in terms of the action step piece of.
Since we didn't hear the exact last thing you said, if you do have any final comments you'd like to share, feel free to do that too, Eboni.
Sure. So I had like another slide where I just talk about the plan and moving from planning to action. Thinking about what can be those bite-sized places where you do check-ins for yourself and with your team, right? 6 months, 1 year, a year and a half. What have you been doing from an equity perspective? Have you looked at what's emerging in the way of new trends in your region? Market alignment, for your graduates, and looking at that broken down by race and ethnicity. But I just wanted to, I guess I'll close with, community college students and professionals have not historically and routinely been engaged sometimes as true counterparts with four-year institutions of higher learning. There's been cultural and social kind of capital, repositories of capital that many of our students at community colleges have not been afforded, but that we don't, kind of cloak them in a veneer of visibility, that we see them, we know that they matter, that we matter, and that our institutions, even though sometimes marginalized within the larger higher ed discourse, do the most for the most marginalized, right? And so it's with that I encourage everyone, particularly community college folks, to keep bringing that positive impact, to the place and space whereby you bring uplift to so many.
Well, again, thank you so much. People can hear, just imagine 100 people doing what I'm doing, Doctor. So thank you so much for being part of this today. We don't have any questions, so I'll go ahead and just do a few closing remarks. So again, a reminder, this session is being recorded. It'll be posted on our conference website along with the PowerPoint, so you can do that and have access to that later. Share it with other folks who couldn't be here. So some of your colleagues maybe weren't able to join us this morning, but you can share the conference website link so they can hear this presentation. I will say thank you again. A lot of chat comments, Doctor, thanking you and sharing all this great information with us. So again, appreciate your time and your expertise and wish everybody a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks so much.